Hey there, viewers. Imagine waking up after a near-death experience with a message so terrifying you wish you had never come back at all. What would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments. A teenage girl died, saw something chilling on the other side, and returned with a warning about Diddy that no one was prepared to hear. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. A doorway to a different world. I woke up to the sound of machines. A soft beeping, steady and rhythmic, the only proof that I was still here. My chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting on it, pressing down with an invisible force. I tried to move, but my limbs were sluggish, weighed down by exhaustion so deep it felt unnatural. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled my nostrils, mixing with something sterile and artificial. I wasn't home. There was something in my throat, a tube. I gagged, but I couldn't move enough to do anything about it. My fingers twitched against stiff, crinkled sheets, but my body refused to listen beyond that. I tried to open my eyes fully, but even that felt like too much effort. The only thing I could make out were blurred figures moving around me, voices murmuring just beyond my reach. They weren't speaking to me. They were speaking about me. She was legally dead for 4 minutes. The words came from somewhere close, a voice, male, detached, like he was talking about a stranger, not a person lying right in front of him. "She's stable now," another voice said, this one softer. "A woman. We'll monitor her closely, but given what she's been through." A pause. "We need to be prepared for anything." I wanted to speak, to ask what they meant, to ask what had happened to me, but the words wouldn't come. My throat burned. My head felt like it had been cracked open and filled with static. 4 minutes. I was dead for 4 minutes. The thought didn't feel real. It was just words, like something you'd hear in a TV show, something that happened to other people. Not me. But then it hit me. This wasn't the first time I had heard those words. Somewhere in the deepest part of my mind, I had heard them before. I tried to remember, but the moment I reached for the memories, they scattered like broken glass. Still, pieces remained. A room with no windows. Someone holding me down. Music, loud enough to shake my bones. And a voice whispering something into my ear, something that made my stomach drop and my skin crawl. I couldn't remember what it was. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't supposed to be here. Before all of this, I was just a girl with a dream. I had turned 18 3 months ago, packed my bags, and left the only life I had ever known behind. LA had always been the dream. Back home, everything felt small, predictable, suffocating. But LA was a place where things happened, where people made something of themselves. I wasn't stupid. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had been willing to try. I had a small following on Instagram, a few thousand people who liked my photos, who left comments telling me I was so pretty, so model-esque, so perfect for LA. It was nothing compared to the real influencers, the ones with brand deals and exclusive invites, but it was enough to make me feel like maybe I was getting somewhere. And then, one night, everything changed. I had been scrolling in bed, aimlessly liking photos, when the DM popped up. It was from someone I had never spoken to before, a name I didn't recognize, but the profile? I stared at the message for a long time before clicking. "You ever been to a real Hollywood party? Not the influencer kind, the real kind?" There was a second message underneath. "I know people. I could get you in, but not just anyone gets invited, only the elite. You interested?" My heart had raced as I read the words over and over. I clicked on the profile. He was followed by people I recognized, models, rappers, influencers. His pictures were taken at expensive locations: Dubai, New York penthouses, private jets. In one photo, he was standing next to Diddy. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't stupid. I had heard stories. Girls who went to the wrong parties. Girls who went missing. But there was another part of me, a part I didn't want to admit existed. that was curious. Because the truth was, I had spent months in LA and I was getting nowhere. The casting calls, the brand deals, the opportunities, they were going to other girls, the ones who were already connected, the ones who already knew someone. If I wanted a real shot, I had to be seen. I had to get into the right rooms. And wasn't that what this was? I told myself it was just a party, that I would go, meet people, have a few drinks, and then leave. So I responded. When and where? The reply came instantly. Friday night? I'll send a driver. Dress well. The house was nothing like I expected. It wasn't in the Hollywood Hills or some over-the-top nightclub. It was a mansion, deep in Beverly Hills, behind gates so high you couldn't see past them. The driver didn't speak much. He was professional, wearing a suit, the kind of man who looked like he had been doing this for years. When I stepped out of the car, I hesitated. The house was quiet, too quiet. I had expected music spilling from the windows, the sounds of people laughing, the usual chaos of a party. Instead, there was nothing but the soft rustling of trees and the distant hum of a security camera adjusting its angle. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman answered. She was beautiful in a cold, controlled kind of way. Older than me, maybe mid-20s, wearing an all-black dress that fit too perfectly to be casual. She looked me up and down before stepping aside. "Welcome," she said, voice smooth and unreadable. "Phone stay in the basket." She gestured to a small table beside the entrance, where a glass bowl was already filled with expensive phones. Something in my stomach twisted, but I forced a smile and did as I was told. The moment the door shut behind me, I felt it. This wasn't like any party I had been to before. There were no groups of drunk girls giggling in the corner, no guys trying to show off by flashing their wallets. It was all controlled, too controlled. Men in suits, standing in clusters, speaking in hushed voices, women dressed perfectly, sitting in silence, sipping from glasses without ever seeming to actually drink. I searched for something normal, a sign that this was just a party, just an opportunity, just a chance to be seen. Instead, I locked eyes with a girl across the room. She was my age, maybe younger, and she was staring at me like I was a deer walking straight into a trap. In the hospital bed, I struggled to breathe. The memories were fragments, shifting in and out of reach like something lurking just below the surface. But I knew one thing. I had been warned, and I hadn't listened. I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to. And I had paid the price. Chapter 2. The House of Shadows. Welcome to the inner circle. The house swallowed me whole the moment I stepped inside. It wasn't like the homes I had seen on Instagram, those sprawling, brightly lit mansions where influencers draped themselves over velvet couches, laughing too loud with half-empty champagne flutes in hand. No, this was something different, something darker. The air itself seemed heavier, carrying a scent that was both expensive and suffocating. Cologne, alcohol, a faint trace of something floral but artificial, like perfume that had been worn too long. The entrance hall was grand, but not in the way you'd expect. The decor wasn't excessive, not dripping in gold or loud displays of wealth. It was deliberate, controlled. The furniture was sleek, modern, all dark wood and cold marble, like a high-end hotel that was designed for discretion. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the polished floors, making the space feel more like a museum than a place where people were supposed to be having fun. But no one here was having fun. The people inside moved differently. The women glided, graceful but stiff, like they had practiced every movement in a mirror before arriving. Their faces were carefully composed, neutral expressions that never lingered too long on any one person. Most of them were beautiful, but there was something off about them, something in their eyes, like they weren't really here. They weren't gossiping, weren't drunk, weren't giggling in the corner like you'd see at any other party. Instead, they sat in neat, small groups, whispering only when necessary, their gazes flicking toward the men in the room as if waiting for some unseen cue. And then there were the men. They were the ones who truly belonged here. You could tell just by looking at them. The confidence in the way they stood, the way they spoke in low, amused voices, exchanging secrets they had no intention of sharing with the women around them. Some were familiar, men I had seen in tabloids, in music videos, in interviews where they spoke about their grind, their success, their hustle. Others I didn't recognize, but that didn't make them less powerful. In fact, they might have been the most powerful of all, the ones who stayed behind the curtain, the ones who funded the industry, not just thrived in it. And every few minutes, their eyes would land on a girl, a silent signal, a small nod, and just like that, she would rise, smooth down her dress, and follow. I told myself this was normal, that this was just how these kinds of parties worked, that this was what it took to get ahead. Then I noticed the doors. Tall, wooden, perfectly polished. At first, they blended into the walls, almost hidden in plain sight. But then I realized they were everywhere. Too many of them, leading deeper into the house, each one guarded by a man dressed in all black, the kind of men who didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even look like they were part of the party. They were just there, stationed like statues, watching everything without appearing to watch anything at all. Something in my stomach twisted, but I ignored it. I hadn't come here to be paranoid. I had come here to network, to meet people, to be seen. A hand touched my arm, snapping me out of my thoughts. I turned, expecting one of the men, but it was a girl. She was young, maybe a year older than me, with warm brown skin and dark, sharp eyes that darted around the room before landing back on me. Her dress was too big for her, something she must have borrowed last minute, the straps slightly off her shoulders, the fabric hanging looser than it should. "You know," she whispered. I blinked. She glanced over her shoulder quickly before stepping closer. "You're new here. I can tell." I hesitated. "And how can you tell?" Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because you still think this is a party." I felt a chill at the way she said it. "What's your name?" I asked. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should tell me. Then she sighed. "Lisa." She looked over her shoulder again, lowering her voice even further. "Listen, I don't know how you got here, but you need to be careful. These men..." She stopped herself. "Just don't get comfortable. Don't drink anything you didn't pour yourself." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. She took a breath, steadying herself, and then she did something strange. She touched her wrist, a light movement, like an absent-minded gesture, but I noticed it. A bracelet, thin, silver, barely noticeable at first. And then I realized every girl in this room was wearing one. The same bracelet. I didn't get the chance to ask her about it, because before I could say anything, a voice cut through the room. "She's wanted upstairs." I turned toward the source of the voice. A man stood at the base of the grand staircase. He was older, maybe late 40s, in a suit that looked custom-tailored, his posture too relaxed, like he had done this many times before. His gaze was already on me, waiting, patient. Lisa's fingers curled around my wrist, tight. "Don't go upstairs," she whispered. "Just trust me on this." But the man didn't look away. He knew I had heard him. I had no choice. I pulled my wrist out of Lisa's grip, forcing a small, polite smile, the way I had seen the other girls do. Then I followed him up the stairs. And the moment my foot hit the first step, I felt it. A shift in the air, like I had just crossed into something I wouldn't come back from. Chapter 3. The Black Room, where no one leaves the same. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I climbed, though the noise was swallowed by the eerie silence pressing down around me. The party continued below, but it already felt distant, as if I had stepped through some invisible threshold, leaving behind the place where the rules still made sense. The man leading me never looked back to check if I was following. He didn't have to. I kept my expression neutral, my back straight, my movements controlled. I told myself this was nothing, that this was just another part of the night, just another step towards something bigger. That was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To be seen, to be noticed. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched farther than it should have. The house had looked massive from the outside, but this was different. Something about the proportions felt off. Too long, too narrow. The lights were dimmer up here, the shadows darker, heavier. My breath felt too loud in my ears. The man in the suit finally spoke. "Wait here." He left me in front of a door, smooth black wood with no handle, a door meant to only open from the other side. A soft click sounded, and the door opened just enough for me to step through. I hesitated. Not because I was scared, not yet, but because everything in my body was screaming at me that this was a bad idea. I ignored it. Inside, the air was different, thicker, warmer. The room was dark, darker than any nightclub, darker than it should have been. The only light came from long, thin red strips embedded into the walls, like veins pulsing faintly beneath the surface. It was enough to see shapes, but not details, enough to understand that I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I stepped forward. Something shifted in the corner of my eye. A mirror, but not a mirror. At first it looked normal. A sleek, floor-to-ceiling panel of glass lining one entire wall. But as I moved, my reflection didn't follow the way it should have. It lagged, a fraction of a second too slow. And then, for the briefest moment, it wasn't my reflection at all. A girl stood in my place. Dark hair, hollow eyes, a silver bracelet on her wrist. I blinked, and she was gone. The room wasn't empty. There were cameras, small, black, perfectly positioned in the corners of the ceiling, in the crevices between the red lights, in places you wouldn't notice unless you were looking. I wasn't the first person to stand in this room. I wasn't the first person to be watched. A soft hum of music drifted through hidden speakers. Not loud, not chaotic like downstairs. Something slow, something meant to sink into your skin. I turned toward the center of the room. And then he walked in. Diddy? His presence filled the space like static electricity before a storm. The air changed around him, thickened. He moved with the kind of ease that only came with knowing he controlled everything, everyone. He was smiling, not wide, not friendly, control, like he already knew exactly how this night would end. He looked at me, then toward a small black table against the wall. A bottle sat there, the glass sweating under the heat of the red lights, 2 crystal glasses. He picked up the bottle and poured one glass, slow and deliberate, before holding it out toward me. Drink. I hesitated, Lisa's warning flashing in my mind. I forced a small smile. I don't drink much. Diddy's lips twitched, a flicker of something in his expression. Smart girl, he said. I didn't move. Ugh, he didn't either. The silence stretched too long. The music, soft and steady, felt like it was building towards something. And then the door behind me clicked shut. A slow, deliberate sound. Not just closing, locking. I turned, my stomach twisting, but I already knew what I would see. The man in the suit was still there, only now he wasn't alone. Another man had joined him, then another. They stepped inside, spreading out just enough to block the door completely. There was no reason for them to be here. Not unless I was meant to stay. Diddy sat down, leaning back into his chair, watching. Not speaking. Just watching. Lisa's voice echoed in my head. Don't go upstairs. I had made a mistake. The realization came too late. A cold feeling spread through me, something deeper than fear, something instinctual. I took a slow breath and turned back to Diddy, keeping my expression calm, my voice steady. "I think I should get back to the party." Diddy tilted his head slightly. "What?" I forced another smile. "I wasn't expecting all this. It's a little overwhelming." He didn't blink. "You came here for a reason, didn't you?" Something in his voice made my pulse quicken. He gestured toward the drink still sitting untouched on the table. "You don't drink, that's fine, but you still came." His eyes darkened. "So tell me, what exactly are you looking for?" Every answer felt dangerous. My skin felt too tight. My heart beat a sharp rhythm in my ears. "I think," I started. But before I could finish, the music changed. Louder now, drowning out everything else. The hand touched my shoulder. I jumped. The man in the suit, closer than before. I turned, but before I could react, another hand, larger, stronger, wrapped around my wrist. The room shifted. The mirrors weren't mirrors. The cameras blinked. The walls seemed to pulse. I tried to pull away. The grip on my wrist tightened. I barely had time to react before something was pressed against my mouth. A cloth, suffocating, heavy, sweet-smelling. The room tilted. The red lights blurred. The music pounding, vibrating in my skull. Laughter muted. My knees buckled. My vision darkened at the edges. The last thing I saw was Diddy's expression. Calmed, like he had seen this play out 100 times before. And then, nothing. Chapter 4, Death and Awakening, The Journey Beyond. There was no pain, no sharp moment of impact, no struggle, no lingering trace of fear, just silence. A deep, endless silence that stretched beyond anything I had ever known. It wrapped around me like a thick, invisible blanket, numbing everything, leaving behind nothing but weightlessness. I wasn't falling. I wasn't floating. I simply was. The red light of the room was gone, swallowed by something vast and colorless. My body felt distant, like a memory, something I had once carried but no longer needed. The weight of my limbs, the tightness in my chest, the pulse in my veins, it had all disappeared. Then I saw her. She looked like me. She was me. Lying there limp and still, sprawled across the dark floor of the room where I had been only moments ago. My hair was tangled over my face, the hem of my dress askew, my bare legs twisted at an unnatural angle. The men around me didn't move with panic. There was no rush, no alarm, no urgency. They had done this before. One of them nudged my arm with the tip of his shoe, checking for a response that wouldn't come. Another pulled out a phone, speaking low into the receiver, a calm, measured voice, reporting a problem, not an emergency. And then, Diddy? He was still sitting in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. His expression was unreadable, like someone watching a mildly inconvenient situation play out. He didn't look at my body, didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, he picked up his own phone and pressed it to his ear. "Handle it." That was all he said. No concern, no hesitation. As if I was nothing more than an object that needed to be removed. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing all black, crouched beside my body, his fingers pressed against my throat, searching for something that wasn't there. "She's gone," he said flatly. A pause. Then, "What do we do with this one?" I felt no fear, not in the way I had expected, because the truth was, I wasn't alone. Something was standing beside me. A presence. It wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't an angel bathed in golden light here to guide me towards something peaceful. It was a shadow. Not shapeless, not formless, but wrong. Its figure stretched taller than any human should be, shifting in ways that didn't make sense, edges flickering like static. There were no eyes, no mouth, no face, just a dark mass that hummed with something I couldn't name. I didn't ask who or what it was. I didn't need to. Because somehow, I already knew. I wasn't supposed to be here. The shadow moved closer, not stepping, gliding. It tilted its head toward the scene in front of us, where the men were still deciding what to do with my body. The voice, when it came, wasn't a sound, not in the way voices usually were. It didn't come from the shadow itself, didn't vibrate in the air around me. It spoke directly into my mind. You weren't supposed to see this. I tried to speak, but I had no mouth, no voice, no breath. But since you're here, the shadow reached out, not with hands, not with anything solid, but with something deeper, something that wrapped around me like an invisible chain, pulling me downward. Let me show you more. And then I fell. It wasn't like falling from a height, not like plummeting toward the ground. It was falling through existence itself, through something vast and endless. The world around me twisted and blurred, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. There was no tunnel of light, no warmth, no comforting whispers. There was only darkness. And within that darkness, faces, hundreds of them, thousands. Some were clear, their features sharp and frozen in expressions of terror. Others were distorted, twisted by agony or blurred beyond recognition. Women, children, their hands reached for me, fingers stretching through the void, grasping at nothing. Their mouths were open, but no sound came out. Screaming in silence, crying out for help that would never come. I tried to move, to reach for them, but I wasn't solid anymore. I had no hands to offer, no voice to speak, no way to stop myself from sinking further into the abyss. The faces kept coming. Some of them I knew. Not personally, not by name, but by story. Girls who had gone missing. Girls whose faces had flashed across the news for a day, a week, before being forgotten. Girls who had been promised something. A career, a future, a way out of whatever small town, whatever desperate situation they had come from. And then they had disappeared. This was where they had gone. Not to another city, not to another life. Here, trapped in something beyond death. A prison without walls. The shadow pulled me deeper. And then I saw the door. It was massive, ancient, not in the sense of time, but in the sense that it had always been here, not made by human hands, not something that had ever been built or could ever be destroyed. It was covered in carvings, symbols I didn't recognize but somehow understood. This was the place where no one ever got out. The faces pressed closer. The silence became deafening. The shadow whispered one final thing. Now you understand. And then I woke up. Chapter 5, The Forgotten Ones, a warning that must be heard. I wasn't back in my body. Not yet. The sensation of waking up had been a lie, just a brief flicker of awareness before I was dragged back down, deeper into something beyond reality. I wasn't floating anymore, wasn't weightless. Instead, I was being pulled. A force stronger than gravity itself yanked me through the darkness, past the endless sea of faces, past the screaming mouths that made no sound. I had no control, no way to resist. And then I stopped. Not gently, not with care. It was as if I had been dropped into a different place, slammed into a moment that wasn't my own, but was being forced upon me. I was somewhere else now. A hallway. Long, endless, stretching in both directions, lit only by dim, flickering bulbs that hummed faintly overhead. The walls weren't walls at all, not really. They were doors, lined up perfectly, identical, heavy, industrial. Each one had a small, square window at the top, the kind of reinforced glass you only see in places that are meant to keep people inside. I knew where I was before I even looked. This was beneath the house, I took a slow step forward, the air around me thick, pressing in on all sides. A coldness clung to my skin, not the kind that made you shiver, but the kind that sank deep into your bones, a feeling of something that had been suffering for a long, long time. I peered through the first window. Inside was a girl. She was young, maybe my age, maybe younger. She sat in the center of a bare room, knees pulled to her chest, staring at nothing. Her hair was tangled, her dress wrinkled, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to disappear. She didn't move, not even to blink. I stepped back. The next door, another girl. The next two of them. More doors, more rooms. Some held girls, some held women. Some were empty. Not because no one had ever been inside them, but because whoever had been there before was gone now. I kept walking. The hallway didn't end. And then the voices started. Not loud, not screaming, in whispers. Soft, broken, filling the space like the remnants of a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I turned a corner and suddenly I wasn't in the hallway anymore. The space around me shifted, and I found myself standing in a different kind of room. A study. Expensive. Dark wood, high-backed chairs, bookshelves filled with volumes no one ever actually read. The lighting was low, casting the room in a deep amber glow. A fire burned in the fireplace, though there was no warmth. I wasn't alone. Men sat around a long, polished table, dressed in suits, their faces calm, relaxed. I recognized some of them, big names. Names I had grown up hearing, men who had shaped industries, built empires, controlled the narratives of entire generation. They were talking. Their voices were even, steady, discussing things that should never be spoken of so casually. I couldn't understand all of it, not at first. It was like listening through water, muffled, blurred at the edges. But then one phrase broke through. "We need to move the inventory before the trial." My stomach turned. They weren't talking about products. They were talking about people. One of the men chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You worry too much. No one's ever found them before." Why would they now? A different voice. This one I recognized. Diddy. I saw him now, at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, fingers tapping idly against the glass of whiskey in front of him. "Because people are getting sloppy," he said smoothly, "and sloppy means problems." The man across from him laughed. "You say that like you haven't gotten away with worse." Diddy's lips curved into something cold, and I'd like to keep it that way. A heavy book sat on the table between them. A ledger. It was thick, worn at the edges, its cover a deep black, embossed with something I couldn't quite read. I stepped closer, drawn to it by some invisible force. No one noticed me, because I wasn't really there. I'd looked down. The book was open to a page filled with names, row after row, some neatly written, some scribbled in rushed handwriting. My eyes scanned the list. Some I didn't know, some I did. Names that had disappeared from headlines years ago without explanation. Girls who had once been famous, girls who had once been on every billboard, every magazine cover, only to fade from public view. Gone, without a trace. And then, names I recognized from my own life. People I had met, influencers who had suddenly stopped posting, models who had abandoned their careers overnight. People I thought had simply moved on, but they hadn't. They were here, somewhere. My stomach dropped. I turned the page, and that's when I saw it. The photograph, tucked between the pages, faded and creased like it had been handled too many times. It wasn't a woman, wasn't a model. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 6. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. She was alone. Not in a home, not in a school. Somewhere underground, somewhere beneath us. My breath hitched. I tried to step back, but my body wouldn't move. Because suddenly, I wasn't in the study anymore. I was with her. The air was damp, thick with the scent of mold and something metallic, something that made my skin crawl. The space was small, barely a room, its concrete walls stained, the light above flickering weakly. The girl was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, her small frame trembling. There was a bracelet on her wrist, thin, silver, identical to the ones the women at the party had been wearing. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes locked onto mine. She could see me. She could see me. Her lips parted, and then a deep, inhuman growl rumbling from somewhere beyond the door. The girl flinched, curling into herself. The door creaked open. A shadow moved in the darkness beyond it, and before I could see more, I was yanked backward. I slammed into nothingness, the world folding in on itself like I had been pulled through time, through existence, through whatever this was. The darkness pressed against me, suffocating, endless. And then the shadow was there again. The same one from before, the one that had pulled me into all of this. It leaned in, and it whispered, "Go back, tell them, but no one will believe you." And then I woke up. Chapter 6, Return, Why They Let Her Live. I gasped awake like I had been dragged out of the deepest part of the ocean, like something unseen had been gripping my lungs, forcing them to hold air they weren't meant to. My chest seized, my throat raw, my body ice cold despite the heat of the room. The light above me was too bright, the sterile white ceiling too harsh, the mechanical beeping of machines too loud. Pressing in from all sides, my hands clenched at the sheets beneath me, the fabric rough against my fingertips. I wasn't dead, but I had been. 4 minutes. I didn't need the doctors to tell me. I knew. I had felt it, seen it, lived it. A shadow moved in my peripheral vision, a shape in the corner of the room. My pulse jumped before I could even think, my body instinctively recoiling as if expecting something to reach for me, to pull me back. But it was just a nurse, her white sneakers nearly silent against the floor. She was checking the monitors, avoiding my gaze. I tried to speak, but my throat was sandpaper, every attempt at a sound coming out hoarse and broken. My body ached in ways that didn't make sense. Deep, gnawing aches in my bones, my muscles, like I had been used up, wrung out, emptied of something vital. The nurse looked at me then, her face impassive, carefully neutral. "You should rest," she said. I tried again, forcing words through the dryness in my mouth. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. She adjusted something on the IV drip beside me, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "You were found unconscious. A seizure," they said. They, not she, not the doctors. My fingers curled weakly into the blanket, a slow realization creeping up my spine. She wasn't telling me what happened, she was telling me what she had been told to say. Something cold settled in my gut. I pushed through the fog in my head, struggling to focus, to think clearly through the dull pounding behind my eyes. My memories were still fractured, scattered like pieces of a puzzle knocked off a table. But I knew the truth. It hadn't been a seizure. It hadn't been an accident. It had been them. The room felt too quiet, too staged, like it wasn't really mine, like it had been prepped, adjusted, watched. Then, footsteps. Not from the nurse, from outside the door. A slow, steady rhythm. Someone coming. The nurse's posture stiffened slightly, so small a movement that most people wouldn't have noticed, but I did. She glanced at the door, then back at me. And just for a second, something flickered across her face. Fear. The door opened. The man who stepped inside wasn't wearing scrubs. Wasn't a doctor. He was wearing a suit. A perfectly pressed dark suit that spoke of quiet power, the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. He wasn't anyone I had seen before, but I didn't need an introduction. I knew who he worked for. He stepped forward with measured ease, his expression unreadable, like he had all the time in the world. He pulled the chair beside my bed out slightly, but didn't sit. He rested a single hand on the back of it instead, looking down at me with a polite smile, the kind meant to be disarming. "How are you feeling?" I didn't answer. His smile didn't falter. "I'm sure this is all a bit overwhelming for you. A terrible accident. You must have been so scared." Blink, didn't move. Because that was the thing about men like him, about men who worked for people like Diddy. They didn't come to ask questions. They came to see if you would play along. He tilted his head slightly, watching me with careful interest. "Do you remember what happened?" I licked my lips, my throat still raw. I needed to be smart, needed to think. I could feel the nurse still standing beside the machines, listening. The air in the room was thick. I shook my head. Not really." His smile widened, just a fraction. "Understandable." He let the words sit between us for a moment before he continued, his voice smooth, effortless. "The doctors say you had a seizure, that you collapsed, hit your head. Scary thing, really." He let that hang in the air, waiting to see if I would accept it, waiting to see if I would pretend that I didn't know the truth. I swallowed, forced myself to nod. "Yeah," I rasped. "Scary." Something in his gaze sharpened, just for a second. Then he reached into his pocket. My heart stuttered, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a phone, turned the screen toward me, and there was a picture of Lisa. Her face, her eyes, but something was wrong. The background wasn't familiar, not a street, not a hospital, not anywhere I recognized. Lisa was missing. And then the man did something that made my blood run cold. He deleted the photo, right in front of me. Gone, like she had never existed. The room spun. My grip on the blanket tightened. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his expression still polite, his voice still calm. "It's best not to think too hard about what happened," he said lightly. "People fall, people get hurt, but life moves on." A pause. A warning. "Wouldn't you agree?" My entire body felt frozen. I nodded. His smile finally reached his eyes. "Good." He tapped the back of the chair lightly before stepping away, his suit pristine, his presence leaving something heavier in the air than when he arrived. "Get some rest." And then he was gone. The door shut behind him. I exhaled shakily. The nurse was already turning away, leaving quickly, as if she wanted to be as far from me as possible. I wasn't safe here. Not in this hospital. Not anywhere. Because Lisa was gone, and I was still alive. The real question was, why? Chapter 7. The message, but no one listens. I sat on the hospital bed for hours after he left, my pulse thrumming like a slow, steady drumbeat against my skull. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet from before. Now it felt suffocating, heavy, like the air itself had thickened with everything I knew but couldn't say. Lisa was gone. The man had deleted her photo like it was nothing, like she was nothing. But I knew the truth. I knew she had been there. I knew what I had seen. The basement, the rooms, the child. I needed to tell someone. The nurse never came back after that. No one did. The hospital felt more like a waiting room now, like it wasn't meant for healing but for containing, keeping me still, keeping me quiet. I wasn't staying. I ripped out the IVs from my arm, wincing as the needle dragged against my skin, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My body protested, still weak, but I forced myself up. My clothes weren't here, but someone had left a folded set of hospital scrubs in the chair by the door. I pulled them on quickly, checking the hallway through a narrow crack in the door. No one was outside. I moved fast, keeping my head down as I made my way through the fluorescent-lit corridors toward the exit signs glowing red above the doors. No one stopped me. I should have felt relief when I stepped outside, when the cool night air finally filled my lungs, but all I felt was watched. I had the message. I knew what I had seen. But who the hell was going to believe me? I went straight to the police. The station was mostly empty when I walked in, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and old paper. A young officer sat behind the front desk, flipping through a stack of reports with the kind of casual indifference that made my skin crawl. He barely glanced up when I approached. "I need to report something." My voice cracked, my throat still raw from the hospital's dry air. The officer sighed, setting his pen down. "What kind of report?" I hesitated. If I said it out loud, if I really said it, then I was making it real. But it was real. I straightened. A crime. A serious one. That got his attention. He sat up slightly. "All right. What happened?" I swallowed. I was at a party in Beverly Hills, and my words faltered. How was I supposed to explain this in a way that made sense? I tried again. "There's a house, a mansion. Girls go there, but they don't all leave." His expression flickered with something I didn't like. Not concern, not alarm, something else. He leaned back. "Which house?" I hesitated. I didn't know the address. I didn't even know exactly where in Beverly Hills it had been. I had been driven there, and after everything that happened, the details were slipping like water through my fingers. "I don't have the address," I admitted, "but I can describe it, and I can tell you who owns it." His brow lifted. "Oh," I inhaled sharply. "Sean Combs." The reaction was immediate. His face closed off. Whatever interest had been there, gone. His fingers drummed against the desk once before he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Look, what's your name?" I hesitated. "Why?" "So I can take your report," he said, too carefully. I could feel it now. The shift. The way he was already dismissing me. My stomach twisted. "You don't believe me?" He sighed again, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "It's not that, it's just..." I waited. Nothing. Just silence. I pushed forward. "I know what I saw. There were girls there, a lot of them, and a basement. There were rooms, locked doors, a kid." His expression barely changed, but I saw it. The flicker, the moment of recognition, like he already knew. The nausea hit me all at once. "You've heard this before," I whispered. He didn't confirm it, didn't deny it. Just held my gaze, a silent, wordless warning. I felt sick. He finally leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "Do you have any proof?" The question slammed into me. The ledger, the names, the basement, the child. I had seen everything. And yet, I had nothing. No pictures, no videos. I had walked out of there with only my memories and a story that no one would take seriously. The officer must have seen something in my expression because his lips pressed together in something almost like pity. "You should go home," he said. My skin prickled. "That's it?" I said. My voice was shaking. "You're not going to do anything?" "There's nothing to do," he said simply. "You don't have an address. You don't have any evidence. If you remember something concrete, then come back." He was already looking past me, as if I had already left. As if this conversation had never happened. I felt my throat tighten. "Lisa is missing," I said suddenly. She was there, that night, and now she's gone. I don't know if she's alive or... He exhaled, rubbing his temples. People go missing all the time in LA. My fingers curled into fists. You know something, I said. His jaw tensed. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You know what's happening, don't you? He didn't blink. Didn't flinch. And then, so quietly I almost missed it. I told you, go home. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned and walked out. The moment I stepped outside, I felt the weight of it all hit me at once. The station, the officer. It had been useless. I checked my phone, my hands shaking, but the screen was blank. My social media, gone. The accounts, hacked. Every post I had ever made, wiped clean. My emails, locked out. My calls, ignored. I was being erased. I had the message. I had seen the child, the ledger, the names. I knew what was happening, but who was going to listen? No one. And that's when I realized the most terrifying truth of all. That was the point. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. I stopped trying to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same things. The dark corridors beneath the house, the locked doors, the faces of the girls who never made it out. I saw Lisa in the crowd, her eyes begging me to listen before she disappeared. I saw the child, the small, fragile thing alone in that room, waiting for someone who was never coming. And I saw the ledger, the names, the pages that held the weight of a truth so ugly, so incomprehensible, that most people would rather pretend it wasn't real. But it was real. They had tried to erase me. They had wiped my social media, locked me out of my emails, made every attempt to disappear me in a way that would be quiet, efficient, a lesson. But I had survived, and now I had one choice left. Make sure they regretted letting me live. I spent days writing everything down, every detail I could remember, every name, every voice, every piece of the puzzle that hadn't quite made sense in the moment. I didn't care how unbelievable it sounded. I wrote it all. I started reaching out. At first, no one responded. I contacted journalists, but their replies were polite dismissals, if they replied at all. Some never even made it to their inboxes, emails bouncing back with error messages I didn't understand. I tried the girls I had met at that party, but they were already gone. Accounts deleted, profiles scrubbed clean, like they had never existed. I started going deeper. There were rumors. There had always been rumors. Whispers in the corners of the internet, on forums buried so deep in the web that it took hours of digging just to find them. Anonymous users talking in riddles, half-truths mixed with conspiracy theories, some of it ridiculous, but some of it matched what I had seen. And then I found them, the other survivors. They didn't all go by their real names. Some of them only existed behind screen names, terrified of being found, of what would happen if they realized they were talking. But I didn't need their real names, because their stories, I already knew them. Some had gone to the same parties, some had been promised the same dreams, some had even been in that same house. One of them told me she had seen the basement 10 years ago. Another told me about the tunnels, a network of them, hidden beneath mansions, beneath the city itself, places that connected, places no one could see from the outside, places that weren't supposed to exist. I asked them about the bracelets. They all knew. They told me once you wore one, you weren't just a guest anymore. You were owned. I felt sick. I asked them about Lisa. No one had heard of her. Not under that name. But one girl hesitated before she responded. She said there was someone who matched her description, a girl who had tried to run. I asked what happened to her. The girl didn't answer. And then a few minutes later, her account disappeared. I was running out of time. And that's when it happened. The message came at 3:47 a.m. It was anonymous, no sender, no contact info. Just a photo attachment. I clicked it, and my heart stopped. It was her, the child, the same girl I had seen in my NDE, the one crying alone in that underground room. She was still there. She was still alive. I barely noticed the words below the image at first, my hands shaking too hard to focus. But when I finally read them, I felt something inside me snap. There was no signature, no explanation, just one phrase: find her before they do.